Welcome back to part 2 of social psychology. In the last segment, we learned that in social psychology, researchers are studying how other people in social contexts affect people's behaviors and attitudes and can be a very powerful influence on our behavior, sometimes much more powerful than we expect. Many social contexts are kind of like a background. We're not very conscious of them. Some of the best-known social psychology studies got their fame from demonstrating how features of that social background had major consequences. Early social psychologists tinkered around with situational and contextual variables, variables that most people assumed were not really that important. This ended up giving social psychology a sort of bad boy of psychology reputation. Why? Because some of these innocuous situations that social psychologists created in the studies they were doing made people do some pretty disturbing things. In fact, institutional review boards, the panels at universities and research institutes that review the ethics of psychology experiments, in part owe their existence to the social psychology studies of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Now, remember, we're still in the section on social psychology, so we're talking about the behavior of normal, average people, not psychopaths or clinically diagnosed populations. However, it turns out that normal, average people do some pretty wild things. Now, in the last section, we talked about how many social psychologists in the United States, at least, entered the field because they were interested in stereotyping and prejudice. Many of them were motivated in part by the civil rights movement that occurred in the U.S. in the 1960s and 70s. But a first generation of social psychology was linked to another historical event, a major event that required explaining, a lot of explaining, why average normal people did horribly awful things. What event are we talking about? Well, it occurred in the middle of the 20th century when Nazi Germany brought the question of why normal average people do horrific things to everyone's mind. Why was a nation of nice normal people, Germany, willing to go along with the idea that certain groups of people needed to be exterminated? The Holocaust and Nazi Germany raised questions that required serious answers, questions about human nature, and questions about how events like the Holocaust could be prevented from ever happening again. And some social psychologists started to do research to provide some answers. One of the major questions prompted by World War II and the Nazi regime was, why did German people obey their Nazi leaders? People have been conforming and obeying authority forever, but Nazi Germany demonstrated it so starkly. This prompted social psychologist Stanley Milgram to do some of the best-known social psychology studies. They are perhaps some of the best-known psychology studies ever. The studies are famous and infamous for a number of reasons. Let's see a video clip now that was taken from the actual experiments that Milgram videotaped. Stop this lecture now and watch the Milgram video. Okay, so, suppose you're a subject in this study. What happens? Well, first of all, there are several roles in the study. There's a teacher, there's a learner, and there's also the experimenter who's directing everything. The teacher in the study was a real subject. The learner, however, was what's known as a confederate. What's a confederate? A confederate is a person who works with an experimenter and plays a certain role in order to produce a particular experimental setting. In the Milgram study, the confederate pretended to be another participant at the beginning of the study. But in fact, when the real participants thought they were hearing another participant later in the study, what they were really hearing was a tape recording of an actor. How did the assignment of roles occur? Well, there were bogus slips of paper, so that the real subject, the one who was going to be the teacher, always was assigned to that role of being the teacher. There was also a cover story. What's that? That's what research participants are told about what the study's about. And in this case, they were told that it was a study about learning and memory, and about the effects of punishment on learning and memory. So, they're then told the learner's going to go into another room, and they'll communicate with the teacher via a microphone. The learner's job is to learn pairs of words, but each time the learner misses a word pairing, the teacher is supposed to give them a shock. Now, what about these shocks? They were supposedly being generated by a machine, and the machine had shock buttons that were labeled in 15-volt increments, from 15 volts all the way up to 450 volts. So, in the study, the learner pretends to learn word pairs, and the teachers test them. The teachers are instructed to give a shock each time the learner misses, and to raise the intensity of the shock each time. Now, why is this study so famous? Under these conditions, what percentage of the participants, that is, the teachers, went all the way to 450 volts? A level that was marked danger, severe shock, XXX, the highest level on the machine. Almost 2/3 of the participants went there. Now, what percentage went beyond 300 volts, the point at which the Confederate, the learner, banged on the wall? 80%. 80%! 80% that thought that they were giving the learner 300 volts of shock, despite the learner's cries of pain. And all of the subjects went as far as the point where the learner first screamed. No one said, excuse me, I would never give anyone a shock over 45 volts. Now, was anyone in the study actually getting shocked? No. Remember, participants are actually hearing a tape recording. They're hearing someone screaming in pain and ultimately going deathly silent. When participants see clips from the Milgram study, it often makes them laugh. Why? I think there's some reasons. One thing is there's old-fashioned dress. The styles have certainly changed since when Milgram did his studies. And the guy screaming, he sounds kind of funny or fake to us. But to real subjects, it didn't sound that funny. They thought he was really in danger. Another reason why students may laugh when they hear this video is that the Milgram study has some pretty serious consequences. When you think about what's going on, here's a researcher that could get almost 2/3 of people to think they were giving a fatal level shock to another person. Now, did the real subjects in Milgram's study, did they laugh as well? Well, yes, they did, but it was a really nervous, uncomfortable kind of laughter. They also sweated, and they showed obvious discomfort. One subject was so uncomfortable that the description of his behavior was likened to having a fit, like he went into convulsions. This suggests that the subjects did think it was a real big deal, and they were obviously conflicted over what to do. They're put in this state of conflict because they have to decide between two things. Should they avoid trying to hurt someone, or should they obey an authority? Maybe another part of what makes us laugh now when we see the Milgram study is that we know what's influencing the subject's behavior. That is, we know the social situation is bogus. It's like we've got the inside scoop. We're made aware of an aspect of their environment that is making them conform. What is visible or obvious to us in hindsight was camouflaged for them. When you're a person in that social situation, it's very hard to step back and see the influences of the situation. We also know now that Milgram's results aren't just something that old farts did in the 1950s. There have been two recent replications. One was done by a professor at Santa Clara University, and he pretty well replicated the study, with some modifications due to ethical concerns about Milgram's original study. One of the largest modifications was that he stopped the study at 150 volts. The reason he did this was that he knew from Milgram's data that most people in the original study who got to 150 volts went all the way. When the researcher at Santa Clara did the study, he found very similar results in the early part of this 21st century as Milgram found in the middle of the last century. The other replication was a documentary that documentary makers in France created with what participants thought was a game show. The game show participants were asked to shock a fellow contestant for getting answers wrong. How far did they go? Well, let's see. Stop this lecture now and watch the video labeled Game Show Replication of Milgram. Okay, this is probably a good time to take a break. Stop the lecture for at least 30 seconds. Make sure you also stand up and stretch. When you come back, we'll talk some more about the Milgram studies. So, what exactly are the components of the social situation in Milgram's experiments? Can we dissect his situations to figure out what it is that makes people so likely to obey? Well, one of the things that we know is going on is that there is an authority figure. Why is the experimenter such an authority figure? Well, one of the reasons may be that the studies were originally done at Yale. This is a fancy, prestigious research university that's been around for a long time and is highly respected. So part of the authority was probably the fact that the studies were associated with Yale. Could Milgram get the same studies if he didn't have Yale to rely on? He was able to do it. He actually tried to replicate the studies off campus. He got a storefront office in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and tried to run the same studies. And the really amazing thing is he got similar results, although not quite as strong. So, the Yale name had some effect in terms of establishing authority, but it doesn't explain all of Milgram's results. Another thing about Milgram's study was that the experimenter always wore a lab coat. And when you think about what a lab coat signifies in our society, it's also a symbol of authority. Who wears lab coats? Well, usually doctors, people who have status, people who have authority. This is the case for other kinds of clothing that also indicate authority. Things like uniforms, things like badges, even simply wearing a suit and tie in some settings gives you some authority. Demographics can also be a sign of authority, things like age, gender, and race. So, for example, in our society, generally people who are older have more authority. When it comes to gender, people who are male have more authority. And race also plays a part. In the US, at least, often whites are considered as having more authority than minorities. I once heard former Congressman Harold Ford Jr. interviewed on a radio show. This was the year that he had been elected to the U.S. Congress. He was a U.S. congressman from Tennessee, and he was African American, and he was among the youngest ever congressmen to serve. He was only 26 years old when he was elected. One day, he was touring the White House with a group of his constituents, which is one of the things that congressmen get to do. And a security guard came up to the group and asked them rudely where their representative was, because you're not just allowed to be a tourist wandering around the White House without your congressional representative. They had to point out that their representative was there. Now, had that security guard seen Representative Ford introducing a bill on the floor of Congress, they probably would have seen him as having greater authority. Similarly, when I lecture in front of a big class, part of my authority is just the fact that I get to stand at the front of the lecture hall. Being in front of a class is kind of like getting to wear a lab coat. We've all had years of training in school to pay attention to the person in the front of the class. Heck, I might not even have to stand in front of a classroom. For example, how many of you turned off the lecture for at least 30 seconds and stood up and stretched when I said to do that a few minutes back? This is an example of situationally induced obedience. Now, it's not a big deal. None of you shocked anyone. And most of the times when a professor or instructor tells you to do something, there's a reason for it. Questioning every assignment would make you a very, very unpopular student. There are good reasons to be obedient. Often it makes sense to follow advice and the command of authority who know more than you. However, sometimes we just have to be aware that just because somebody seems like they know what they are talking about, they might not. Now, this leads us to a fourth factor that led to obedience in Milgram, and that was the unwavering nature of the experimenter. This guy had no hesitation, so he had to be right. He kept saying, "You must continue. The experiment that you requires that you continue." He didn't seem to ever doubt himself. There was another variation of the Milgram studies where Milgram had two experimenters, and at some point in the study they disagreed about whether the experiment should go on. This disagreement raised some doubts about the authority of the experimenter who said the study should continue. What happened when the two experimenters disagreed? Well, think for a second. Think what your prediction might be. What happened was 100% of the teachers, that is, the participants in the study, stopped giving shocks to the learner at the point where the two experimenters disagreed. So one way to undermine authority is to have another authority who disagrees with you. Now let's think also a little bit more about this situation. Have you ever been asked to shock another person? It's not really a very common experience. The participants in Milgram's study probably also had never been asked to shock someone, and they may never have been in a psychology experiment. In fact, they may never have been in the buildings on the Yale campus. They were responding to an ad that they saw in the newspaper. All of this contributed to making them unsure about what to do in this difficult situation. When we are unsure, or when a situation is ambiguous, we are more likely to rely on social cues to decide what we're supposed to do. We're more likely to conform to what other people are doing. What other people are doing is a very strong cue to us about what we should be doing. Think for a second, which way do you face when you ride an elevator? Probably most of you are thinking, well, I face the front, I face the door. Do you think you could be influenced to face the rear of the elevator? Let's see the powers of conformity. Stop the lecture now and watch the video called Candid Camera, Face the Rear. So, why do people conform? Social psychologists often talk about two classes of reasons: normative influences and informational influences. Normative influences, what are they? They're a desire to be liked, accepted, and approved of. When we conform due to normative influence, we demonstrate that we are part of the group. We are conforming so people will like us, so we feel accepted. Now this makes us sound kind of like we're like sheep, but there are real social costs to not conforming in many situations. If you're curious about the costs of not conforming, try walking around town without wearing anything below your waist and just see how people react. Or, more subtly, the next time you go out with a group of friends and see a movie that everybody says they like, try saying that you thought it was a rotten movie. How does doing that make you feel? And what kinds of reactions do you get from your friends? The other big reason for conforming is informational influence. Wanting to be correct and wanting to understand how the best way is to behave. So, we conform to experts, to elders, to leaders. If my yoga instructor tells me to pull my leg up to my ear, okay, I'm going to try and do it. Now, let's look at some factors affecting just how likely we are to conform. One of these factors is the size of the group. How does size affect conformity? Well, think about it. Are you more likely to conform when one other person is doing something or when three are? How many other Candid employees were there in the Candid Camera video? 3 seems to be kind of a magic number for conformity. As a group gets smaller than 3, that's something like a group of 2 or just 1, people are less likely to conform. But when you add a lot of people beyond 3, there's not that much difference. 3 is where you get the most bang for the buck. Another factor affecting conformity is the importance of the group. We're more likely to conform to groups that we admire, that we're attracted to, that we identify with, and that we're attached to. Here's a trick question. If there's a group we admire, are we more likely to conform to them due to normative or informational influence? Well, I told you it was a trick question. It could be both. Often, normative and informational influence go hand in hand. If we admire and respect a group, we may both want to be liked and accepted by them, and we think that group has knowledge about the best way to do things. If we admire them, we also probably want their approval more. You can think about freshmen in high school and how desperately they want the approval of seniors. That would be an example of what? Well, normative influence. But also, if we admire a group, we may think that they are more likely to be right about things. Those seniors just may know something about getting through high school. And if we conform to them for that reason, then that's an example of informational influence. A third factor affecting conformity is the unanimity of a group. Is the group unanimous? Suppose all of your friends have decided to go as a group to a costume ball as Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which you actually think is kind of a dopey idea. Are you more likely to protest the decision to go as this for the costume party if you're the only person who doesn't want to dress up that way, or if there's one other person who also doesn't want to dress up that way? Which is easier to stand up to, a unanimous group or one with a few other holdouts? Unanimity in a group makes a big difference. People are much more likely to conform when a group is unanimous than if they have even just one ally against the majority. This phenomenon was demonstrated in a series of famous social psychology studies by Solomon Asch. The studies were done in the 1950s. Asch had groups of subjects judge which of 2 lines were the same length. Asch would show his participants a target line and then 3 other lines of varying lengths and ask them which of the 3 lines was the same as the target. Now, it was pretty obvious which of the lines was the same length as the target. These were not difficult perception questions. Like Milgram, Asch used Confederates in his study. In fact, he used a whole group of Confederates, and everybody in the study was a Confederate except for one real subject. Now, the Confederates, after a few warm-up rounds, began to give answers that were wrong, so they would indicate a line that was clearly not the same length as the target line. What Asch wanted to know is, what would the real subjects do? Would they give the right answer, or would they conform and give the same answer that everybody else was giving, the wrong answer? What Asch found was that about 75 of the participants in his studies conformed on at least one trial. and about 1/3 of the participants conformed on half or more of the trials, that is, the trials where the Confederates gave the wrong answers. However, the presence of just one other ally, one other person who didn't go along with the majority in giving the wrong answer, so that that answer was no longer unanimous, that essentially made the conformity in the Asch studies go away entirely. So, were the Asch conformity studies an example of normative influence or informational influence? If we wanted to claim that they were due to informational influence, then we'd have to show that the participants weren't really sure which was the correct answer, and they were conforming because they wanted to do the right thing. But was that the case in this study? Remember, I told you that the lines were pretty obvious. It was pretty clear which was the right answer. So the subjects didn't actually believe the wrong answers they were giving were correct when they gave them. As more evidence that Asch's studies were due to normative influence, Asch ran a variation in which the true subjects, the real participants, didn't have to give their answers out loud. That is, they didn't have to say them publicly. When they got to write down which line they thought was the same length as the target on a piece of paper, conformity dropped way down. But it is true, if everyone else is doing it, that kind of makes us ask ourselves if we're missing something. And in some cases, unanimity affects not only normative influence, but also informational influence. And it should. Other people are a valuable source of information. So you attend a worship service that you're unfamiliar with, a church that you don't normally go to, or another faith. Everyone stands up at a certain point during the service, so you do too. Probably you're doing it due to a bit of normative influence, but also probably due to informational influence. Everybody else in this particular service is doing it. It must be the right thing to do. So, once again, we see that informational and normative influences may be intricately tangled. And this leads us to yet another factor affecting conformity. We are more likely to conform when a situation is ambiguous, when we are unsure what is going on. That's when we're most likely to look to others as a source of knowledge. Another factor affecting conformity is when a situation is a crisis. This is, of course, related to the ambiguity of a situation. When a situation is a crisis, we panic and are unsure what to do. Crises are rare by definition. If it happens all the time, it's not so much of a crisis. It's something we're used to. Because crises are rare, we are more likely uncertain about what to do, so we look around at what everyone else is doing. Conformity plays a big role in situations in which people are trying to decide if they should provide help to another person in a public place. In this next video clip, you're going to see what social psychologists found out when they planted a person in a public place that needed help. Watch the conformity of the people. Stop the lecture now and watch the video clip about helping. So, when we see someone in a public place, we're often unclear about whether the person really needs help. That's the case if the situation is ambiguous. You thought you heard someone moaning, but you're not sure. And if that's the case, you're less likely to help unless someone else helps out. Similarly, if it's a crisis, which is often the case when people need help, this also affects whether other people are going to help. In a crisis, are people more or less likely to conform? Well, we just learned that they're more likely to conform. So if everybody just panics and runs, then the people who are in need of help are less likely to get it. Finally, if there are any experts present, or at least people who appear to be experts telling people what to do to help, people are more likely to help under those circumstances. And remember what we learned in the Milgram experiments. It doesn't take much to appear as an expert. A lab coat or some other official article of clothing will do it. Or you could simply deliver instructions in an unwavering fashion, like the experimenter did in the Milgram study. Actually, it's not that hard to take charge in a crisis by simply acting like you're in charge, telling, that is, not begging or asking, everyone else what to do. In fact, you can use this trick even if you are the person in need of help. You can say things like, "You, there in the orange jacket, call the police, and you in the brown corduroy pants, get everyone to step back and give me some air." Assigning specific people specific jobs is also important to prevent another thing that reduces helping, and that is diffusion of responsibility. This is a reduction in perceived individual responsibility due to the presence of other people. Maybe you've seen it if you've ever shared a kitchen with roommates. You think to yourself, it's not fair, I didn't make this mess. Why should I have to wash the dishes or pick up the papers or throw out that 2-week-old pizza? Shared refrigerators are actually some of the best examples of diffusion of responsibility. Everyone assumes that everyone else will be the person to throw out that thing with pink fuzzy mold growing on it. There are two big reasons for diffusion of responsibility when it comes to not helping. The first is sad but true. We don't help due to self-serving interests. Other people are here. Why should I get involved? Why should I get my hands dirty? Why should I be the possible witness to the crime or take time out of my day? So one reason we don't help others in need is because of the potential costs to us. It's kind of icky. Who wants to get involved with this? Maybe it's a lover's spat and I'll be embarrassed. Maybe when you try to defend someone else, that person attacking them will attack you. This is actually a major concern in neighborhoods with gang activities now. People don't want to help out because they don't want to be seen as the next target. But diffusion of responsibility occurs not only because we're slackers or scared, there's also an informational component to diffusion of responsibility. In the case of someone needing help, suppose you're not sure if this is an emergency or if that person really does need help. So what do? You look around for cues from other people. The problem is they are all looking around at you. And what cue are you giving off by not having helped? You've given the same cue that they're giving you. What you're saying by not helping to other people is that, this isn't an emergency. And that's the message you're getting from other people because they're not helping either. What you think is, if this were an emergency, everyone would be running around trying to help. But everyone's just standing around looking at each other. So it must not be an emergency. There's probably a little bit of both explanations, both the self-serving interests and the informational component, in most cases where people fail to help. Here's one of the cool things about learning about the bystander effect. That is the effect where nobody helps because they're all looking around at everybody else not helping. When you learn about the bystander effect, you will be less likely to be a bystander in the future. Beeman did a study examining this. He used students who were taking a class. When the students left the classroom, they encountered someone slumped over outside in the hallway. For students in one introductory psychology class, they encountered this person before hearing a lecture about helping. For students in another intro psych class, they encountered the person slumped over after they'd heard a lecture about helping. Those who encountered the person after they'd learned about bystander effects were more likely to help the person. So, see, taking psychology makes you a better person. In conclusion, conformity gets a bad name from Milgram and other studies that have shown that people will follow all the bystanders and not help each other out. But conformity is something that's essential for smooth social interactions. Following traffic laws is essentially conformity. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't be too thrilled about getting out on roads where all the drivers had been encouraged to express their individuality. In some situations, even in the very individualistic American culture that many of us live in, conformity is seen as a sign of respect. For example, we stand when a judge enters a courtroom. We stand when a bride walks down the aisle to get married. When we're in another country or in another culture, we often try and conform to different norms in order to demonstrate that we're not ethnocentric. It's a sign of sensitivity. When we think about it, the quintessential ugly American is a tourist who doesn't conform to local norms. Obedience to authority also has its place. Legitimate authorities frequently know what they are talking about, so it's a good idea to obey them. So, the take-home message from this lecture is not that obedience or conformity are always bad, but that we sometimes fail to notice how powerful social situations are in getting us to obey or conform, and we overlook the situational variables which influence our behaviors.